and he's recognizing a lot of the words they're using because he knew Romani. And so he got them to write down 1,000 words in their Indian language. And the next time he went back home, he took the list to the Rroma that he knew, and according to the story, they understood every single one with ease. Well, that's a huge exaggeration. But something like that must have happened. I actually chased this down. I went to Leiden, I checked out the records from 1760 and so on. There's no record of this guy ever having been there. And it's a bit of a mystery. But something must have happened. We've never found that list of 1,000 words. It's only been written about. But something must have happened, because as the story goes, and it appeared in the Vienna Gazette, he passed this information along to somebody else, who then passed it along to the editor of the Vienna Gazette, and it finally got into print in 1776, so 16 years before it got into print. And once that happened, there was tremendous interest, because we're in the period of the Enlightenment, and a lot of academic areas are beginning to emerge, including linguistics. And if you know anything about philology and linguistics, the early interest was in the so-called classical languages, Greek and Latin and Sanskrit. And the study of Sanskrit was central to the early beginnings of linguistics. And here was a population on the very fringes of European society, at the very bottom, speaking a language descended from this noble Sanskrit language, which was kind of an anomaly. And so a number of scholars, European scholars, most of them German, thought to themselves, well, if they speak an Indian language, they must be from India. And that's a dangerous assumption, of course. Specific languages are not passed genetically, they're passed socially. And when I tell my students about this, I make the point that I have students who are native speakers of English, whose ancestors may have been African or Chinese or Mexican, but they're native speakers of English. And on that basis, I cannot assume that they're Anglo-Saxons. But back then, the idea was, well, if you speak an Indian language, you must be Indian. As it turns out, they were right. But having started this line of pursuit, the questions were, okay, if these Xylena are Indian, what are they doing in Europe? When did they leave? Why did they leave? Do they have a country? All these sorts of questions. And the first full-length book about Roma was by somebody called Grellman. It came out in 1784. And in it, and it was a very racist book, very negative in his description of the Roma. But he said, well, if we look at Roma today in Europe, or Zigeuner, this is the German word, they are so poor and shunned and marginalized, and they do all the crappy jobs, and they play music on street corners and so on. This is what they must have done in India. So they must have come from the lowest caste in the Indian caste system, which would be Shudra. And this was the assumption. And as we get into the 1800s, there's more discussion about this. And in 1829, an English army man called Colonel John Harriot wrote an article in a journal where he claimed to have discovered the answer to who the gypsies were. And that's the word he used, English. He said the story of what the gypsies are doing in the West is in the history of Persia, a book written in the 11th century called the Book of Kings. And in the Book of Kings, there's a story about an episode that took place in the 5th century when the son-in-law of the Shah of Persia visited his father-in-law. He was from India, but he was visiting his father-in-law in Persia and noticed that the Persian subjects all looked miserable. So he said, when I go back to India, I'm going to send you a gift of 10,000 musicians to cheer up your subjects. And evidently this happened because the same story turns up in about 4 different independent places. A couple of them say 10,000 musicians, a couple of them say 12,000 musicians, but we can assume that something like that must have happened. But Harriet took it a bit further. He said, now here we've got evidence that a whole lot of Indians left India at one time, came west into Persia, and they were musicians. And look, a lot of the gypsies in Europe are musicians. And there's nothing in the Book of Kings to say that they ever went back to India. In fact, the story goes that after 1 year, the Shah, Hancock of Persia, got tired of him and just told him to go away. And that was the end of the story in the Book of Kings, the Shahnameh. And so Harriet says, well, they must have just kept coming west, and then they all came into Europe. And that became the established story. And to this day, it gets repeated. I have a book for children about gypsies that came out 2 years ago from an American publisher, and it repeats this story. Well, in recent times, there have arisen, if you like, Romani people who have become educated in the Western way and who have become historians and linguists and who grew up speaking our language and who have re-examined the details of our history. And the picture that we have is very different. What we know is, well, let me tell you how we did it. It's like a detective story. The language that we speak is an Indian language. There's no Indian language in India that's quite like it. If we look at our language, it's certainly Indian, but it has features from several different Indian languages. Even in our numbers, when we count up to 10, there are 4 different Indian languages represented, even in just counting up. That points to a mixed population, not a single population. If we look at the kinds of words in the language, there are quite a lot of words having to do with warfare. The word for soldier, the word for prisoners of war, the word for spear, dagger, setting up camp, taking down camp, all kinds of military words. And these are Indian words. That's important, because if you look at our Romani language, a good metaphor for it is an onion. If you think of an onion as being built up layer upon layer. That's what the language is like. The heart of it is Indian. But then there's a layer of Persian. Then there's a layer of Armenian. Then there's a layer of Greek. And then there's a layer of this, that, and the other. And each layer represents a move through space, geographically, and encountering other people and picking up new words as you go along. So that's very handy. But if we look at the Indian words, obviously these were there to start with. They weren't picked up later. It means then that the military words were there from the beginning, which means the people were military from the beginning. Now, if we look at changes that languages go through over time, just like English, for example, if any of you have done English history, you know there was Old English, like Beowulf, right? Then there was Middle English, like Chaucer, and now we speak modern English. If you know anything about Romance languages, you know that French and Italian and so on, Spanish, come out of Latin over time. And you also know that Latin, anybody done any Latin?
Not recently.
Anybody know any German?
Years ago.
Okay, you know that lots of languages have gender. So you have masculine and feminine. And you know that some languages have 3 genders, masculine, feminine, and neuter. German does, Russian does, Latin did. But if you know that about Latin, and you know that the languages that have come out of Latin, like French and Spanish and Italian, only have 2 genders, right? They lost the 3rd gender, the neuter. Well, Indian languages had 3 genders, but then when they got into the new Indian languages, they lost the neuter gender. And that happened around the year 1000. Romani only has 2 genders. If it had 3, it would have had to leave. Then we could say maybe the Persian story about the musicians may be right, because 5th century, certainly, 3 genders. But Romani only has 2. So it must have left somewhere after about the year 1000. But then, the first evidence of Roma in Europe is around 1250, 1300. So now we've got this little window in time to account for, leaving India around 1000, showing up in Europe around 1300. What's happening in between? How do we get from there to there? That means, okay, we've got a time. Now we've also got this military aspect. So the next thing we did, it was a small group of us, what is going on in India around the year 1000 that's military, that would have brought lots of different Indian languages together? And we find right away that there were a number of raids. There were about 17 raids over about a 25-year period of time from somebody called Mahmud of Ghazni, Mohammed of Ghazni. Ghazna, this is in Afghanistan today, city. But there was a huge empire called the Ghaznavid Empire, roughly where Afghanistan is, trying to expand, and it was being led by Mohammed, and he was moving eastwards into India, trying to spread his empire, but he was also moving westwards into Persia, trying to expand that way. And on the eastern side, he was fighting the Hindus. There was no single India at that time, but lots of different areas with different kings. And the Indian response was to assemble armies to try and stop the spread of the Ghaznavids. And these people were assembled in different military camps, army camps, and the general language of the Indian military was Persian. It wasn't any single Indian language. There were lots of them, but they used Persian as the administrative language. Those encounters with the Hindus were almost all defeats for the Indians. Either they were killed in huge numbers or taken prisoner, their temples burned down, taken prisoner. It wasn't just soldiers, that's important too. The soldiers, many were called Rajputs, were all men, of course. But even more than they were soldiers were camp followers. And the camp followers were men and women, and their job was to look after the warriors and feed them and dress their wounds and prepare the battlefield, set up the tents, mend the broken weapons and all of that. On the western front of the Ghaznavid Empire, they were fighting another population called the Seljuks, also Muslims, but enemies of the Ghaznavids. They were trying to spread their empire in that direction. The Hindu prisoners of war allied themselves with the Seljuk prisoners of war, and together they were able to defeat their captors. This happened in 1038, and that was the end of Muhammad of Ghazni. Then the Seljuks, together with the Indians, moved up and took over the kingdom of Armenia. That happened in 1071. Well, Armenia is at the eastern end of Anatolia, and the Seljuks established their own sultanate, the Sultanate of Rum, R-U-M, which was allied with the Byzantine Empire. Now, the Byzantine Empire was the eastern empire, eastern province, if you like, of the Roman Empire. And it was Christian, and the general language was Greek. And this is where this mixed population of Indians kind of came to rest for a couple of hundred years. And during that period of time, through intermarriage with each other and with surrounding Greeks and Armenians and others, Kurds and different populations, gradually crystallized into an ethnic population. Up until this time, it was a disparate population identified by profession, really, but now being settled. And what happens with Indians overseas is that the fact of being Indian outside of India becomes more important than caste differences, which in India may prevent you from marrying out of your caste. But if you look at Indian populations here in this country, in Fiji, Mauritius, East Africa, people whose families would never have married while in India marry now, because after all, we're all Indian, right? So we start to get a Romani population taking shape, and at the same time, the Romani language becoming a native language. If we look, and this is what we understand now, if you look at the Romani language, it's never been spoken in India. That's interesting. It's an Indian language that was never spoken in India. We are an Indian people who didn't exist in India, but our genetic makeup is clearly Indian. Even 1,000 years later, we all have it. But if you look at the breakdown of the different dialects, there seems to be three major big dialect groups in Europe. An early one, a middle one, and a later one. And the early one is represented by Romani populations that are around the fringes of Europe. Obviously, they're the ones who went furthest. They went right to the coastlines. So up through Scandinavia, through the British Isles, down through Spain, and even in the southern Balkans and parts of Italy, there are dialects of our language which are the earliest kinds of Romani. Then we get a bit later, which are spoken in the central area, in Czech Republic, Slovakia, parts of Hungary. Then we get a later one, which is distinctive in that it seems to have originated with the move of the Ottoman Turks westward into Europe. Once again, a move initiated by this expansion of Islam out of India because of the eastward movement of the Ghaznavids, into Europe because of the western movement of the Ottoman Turks. And when the Ottomans took over the Byzantine Empire and kept on coming up into the Balkans, bringing Islam and the Turkish language with them, they brought Roma also. And it's interesting that those